all Kenyans know that we are right in the thick of the budget season. It's a very busy moment, which will culminate in a reading of the budget speech before Parliament next week on Thursday. But before that happens, there's a series of other activities and processes determined by the Constitution, the public finance management laws, and all other laws in Kenya, which require different arms of government to prepare for basically the appropriations on one side, which is basically the spending proposals, and the taxation proposals. Following a very robust engagement last year with Parliament and among Kenyans in the media, in different groups discussing the finance bill, it's become very, very clear that the finance bill is a significant point of convergence among many Kenyans in terms of a discussion of what its implications are for our income, for our investments, for our savings, and obviously the tax liability that all of us bear. Because it is a finance bill which authorizes taxation proposals which are used to fill up the spending side. I mean, to fill up the taxation collected and the spending side of the public budgets. Now, there's an ongoing process as well, which is related to what will be spent and where the spending will be in terms of the programs, the activities. But today, we are focused on discussing the finance bill in 2022, which was dated the 9th of May. It was released, and for those of you who would like to find a copy, we haven't provided a link, but you could quickly check on National Assembly's website, and a copy is available for all of us to review as we go ahead. Now, the IEA is a think tank, and part of our purpose is to try and frame public policy questions to help people to seek answers, but also to provide a platform such as this in which we can canvass views, but at the same time create public education around important policy processes and important policies themselves, such as the finance bill for this 2024 year. And I have three colleagues today who will take us through different portions of the finance bill, discussing the content, the implications, and to try to explain what they mean. Then after that, we'll allow for a back and forth and a conversation. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, we have a chat box right at the bottom, and if you look at the top of your menu bar, you can send any questions that you have, and my colleagues will try and prepare as the presentations go to have the answers ready. But at the same time, any conversation that you wish to have regarding this will be available for anybody to respond. So I have three colleagues who will be responding to this, and we have divided the conversation into three parts. So my colleague Jacqueline Kagume, who's a program officer in our Constitution Law and the Economy program, will take us through the first part of it, which will be discussing the Income Tax Act and the tax procedures. And then we'll have Raphael Muyo, who's also a program officer in our Public Finance Management program, who will discuss VAT and the miscellaneous fees and levies. And the third and final part will be discussed by my colleague Maureen Barassa, who's an assistant program officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and she'll be discussing the excise duty. The tax law, if you look at it, the finance bill, if you look at it, is divided into 7 parts. My colleagues will mention that each of our colleagues will handle specific questions, and then thereafter, each of them will have 15 minutes to 20. And so in the first 1 hour, we'll complete the conversation, and then we'll open up for another half an hour or so for the conversation regarding the rest of the bill. So thanks again for being here. I'll advise two things. While the conversation is going on, please keep your camera switched off and your microphones muted. And if you have any question, please send it in the chat box and we'll try to process it the conversation goes. So right now, I welcome Jacqueline Kagume, who's a program officer. Jackie, please welcome.
That's the outline of our presentation here. So we begin, I think part of the background has been provided, which is basically the context for the formulation of this current finance bill. Then I will look at the income tax amendments. Please note that this is highly summarized and we are not dissecting the entire clause-by-clause provisions. We are just highlighting some of what we thought was some salient provisions or amendments. And then we'll have the value-added tax provisions. Sorry, let me add that. Sorry. Okay, so then we'll have the value-added tax amendments, which will be discussed by my colleague Raphael, the excise duty amendments by my colleague Maureen. But as I will be concluding the income tax amendments, I'll talk briefly about the tax procedures, the amendments related to tax procedures, and Raphael will also discuss briefly the amendments related to customs. So the miscellaneous amendments are related to customs duties. And then we'll end with a conclusion. So basically, that's our outline. I hope I'm audible. So then in terms of a summary, one of the things that we realized when we've been doing an analysis of the finance bill annually, and one of the things that we realized is that there are numerous, so first of all, in our assessment, Kenya's tax code is complex, and every year we see numerous amendments adding to the complexity of the law, which if you think about it in the context of what taxation law or how an ideal or model taxation law should be, certainty is among certainty, simplicity. There are various canons or tenets of taxation, and ours seems to be far from it. So ours is in fact complex as opposed to being an easy code that has uniformity in terms of the procedures. So in terms of tax complexity, we summarized, looking at the amendments done in this year alone, we find that there are at least in total, how many? Sorry, there are, I'll talk about, so the preliminaries has about 3 changes. It proposes to make 3 changes. Then the first part of the bill, so part 2, the preliminary is part 1 of the bill. So part 2 proposes to make 26 changes. That's on the income tax, which runs from section 22 to section 2 to 27. And then we have 6 changes made under the value added tax provisions. And then, but it's not just 6 block changes, it's the major amendments, but then in there we have sub amendments, new insertions, and so on. And then under the Excise Duty Act, we have amendments related to at least 6 proposing to make at least 6 changes. For miscellaneous fees and levies, we have about 5. And then for tax procedures, we have 13. And then in total, we have about 64 changes. And then, I mean, that winds up to 136 pages in 7 parts. So that does not include, as I said, some of the, the schedules. So it's a very comprehensive law that is just amending something that is done annually, a law that is done annually, which of course is not the ideal if we are to have if we are to think about a model taxation law. So that's a summary of the tax complexity of this year's bill. That said, we'll go into now looking at the specific provisions. So the analysis or the summary of the 2024 finance bill. And before I start with the income tax amendments, so I said I'll summarize just a few of the income tax amendments and a few of the tax procedures. But before I summarize this, I think it's important for us to just mention what exactly is the purpose of taxation, so that even as we're discussing the main proposals here, we can see whether, and my colleagues will also mention as they discuss their individual sections, we can see whether it's actually the proposals that have been made by our legislators are actually intended to meet the purposes of taxation, or it's for whatever other reason. So generally, we know that there are 3 main purposes or objectives of taxation. The first one is usually to generate revenue, to raise revenue for government spending, provision of public goods and services. That's the first one. Then the second objective is usually for income redistribution, taking into account the differences, the societal differences in terms of income and wealth. So taxation is one of the methods that proposes to redistribute income. And then lastly, the third one is it aims to regulate behavior or change behavior. So, for instance, by our colleague will explain the objective of the excise duty or the intended objective of what excise taxes should do, but it's basically to change behavior or regulate certain behavior. So even as tax laws are enacted, they're supposed to be in compliance with those three, and it should be very clear what each tax head is intending to do. But from IEA's assessment, we've seen over the last couple of years that there seems to be an overlap between sometimes what is intended by the tax proposal and what objective it's trying to meet is not always very clear. So that's a summary. Now, if I'll go now to looking at the income tax amendments. So the first one, so we could just go to, yes. So the first, again, as I mentioned, we are not looking at a clause by clause analysis, but rather we are discussing the summary of some of the main findings that we had. So if I start with the income tax one, so clause 4, without looking at the definitions clause, so this is an amendment proposed to Section 4A of the Income Tax Act, which is Cap 470. So this clause relates to income from businesses where foreign exchange loss or gain is realized. And just last year, an amendment was made, rather a provision was enacted to provide the period for this as 5 years. This year, there has been an amendment that is proposing to limit the period within which a person can defer and claim a foreign exchange loss from 5 years to 3 years from the date this loss is realized. So the implication, so we talk about the amendments and then we talk about what implication this might have on basically like the business environment or for investment. So in this instance, we are saying that the implication is that this amendment violates the principle, the taxation principle of certainty, where we say that proposals or taxation proposals should be should allow for certainty in the business environment. And for instance, in this one, currently, as I said, the Income Tax Act provides that realized foreign exchange loss for a company whose gross interest paid or payable or payable to a non-resident person exceeds 30% of the company's interest. This person should be able to defer and claim back this interest over a period not exceeding 5 years from the date the loss is realized. So, and we are seeing that now this has been changed back to 3 years, which is providing a less amount of time, considering that they may not have actually been able to provide or make proper assessments of what the exchange, the full exchange, or realize the full exchange implications of the full exchange loss or gain. So what we are saying is that because this proposal comes just a year after the Finance Act 2023 had capped this deferment period to 5 years, if changed back, this is likely to negatively affect the persons who are not able to claim these foreign exchange losses within the reduced period that has been provided. So that's the first one. So it's likely to have negative implications for long-term investors. It's also negative for persons whose businesses are supported primarily by, for instance, borrowing that relies on foreign exchange or currency exchange losses, and currency exchange considerations. So that's the first amendment. Then the second one is on, we move next to clause 6. So in terms of the the next amendment, which is proposing to amend Section 5 of CAP 470. So it's Clause 6 of the Act, talking about income from employment. And here, the proposal is basically intending to insert a new paragraph in subsection 4 of the CAP 470 after paragraph F. And here it reads that any amount paid or granted to a public officer to reimburse an expenditure incurred for the purpose of performing official duties, notwithstanding ownership of control of assets purchased, is listed under exemptions of income from employment. So effectively, this will provide an exemption of amounts paid or granted to public officers to reimburse expenditures incurred from even purchasing assets that will be deemed to be owned on a personal basis, but any expenditure, because it's basically any expenditure that had been incurred for purposes of performing official duties. So because this amendment had been proposed last year, one of, I think, several institutions, including the IEA, had mentioned that it was likely to be prone to abuse because, first of all, it doesn't, the justification as to why the exemption for this kind of expenditure is only to public officials is not very clear, and it's also in violation of the equity principle of taxation. So they will see that there's a possibility of abuse by public officials if that kind of income will be exempted from taxation. And so what we were, in our view, that amendment should be expunged. So yeah, we can move to the next one. Then on clause 7 of the bill, which is on withholding tax, read together with clause 25, this clause or amendment relates to withholding tax on income from digital marketplaces. And so basically the finance bill through this clause proposes to amend Section 10 of the income tax to introduce withholding tax on income earned from digital marketplaces or platforms. And it has gone ahead and described what constitutes or the scope of these digital marketplaces and platforms at a rate of 5% for resident persons and 20% for non-residents. And so this is in respect of digital content monetization of goods, property, and services. So again, based on what I had said earlier, that the intention here could be, if you think about what the framers or the framers intended, the intention here could be that it's to expand the revenue base and increase the revenues collected from taxation, from redefining these digital marketplaces and expanding this withholding tax. However, we think that it's useful to also consider what other implications might follow from sometimes expanding or adjusting the tax rate without considering the other factors. So for instance, what we're saying is that the higher withholding tax rate for non-residents may discourage international digital platforms from operating in Kenya, because for instance, we see that the rate is higher for non-residents. So they could choose to exit the market if the tax burden becomes unsustainable. And then there's also an likelihood for unintended consequences in terms of the competitiveness of Kenya's digital marketplace. We are likely to see, it is possible that we're likely to see the shifting, or when you adjust a tax rate, increase a tax rate, that cost is more often than not passed on to consumers. So it's likely to inflate the cost of different services provided over the digital marketplace, which means a shift in the tax incidence or the bearer of the costs. So those are things that should be considered. And then, yes, I think I've already mentioned that this is likely to increase, that this is likely to shift, that these persons are likely to shift the burden of the tax incidence to the consumers. Then the next one is on clause 8, which is on the repeal and replacement of section 12E of the Income Tax Act. So this is also related to the previous. So this is basically the repeal of the digital service tax and a replacement with the significant economic presence tax at a proposed tax rate of 6%. So I think what we had previously was about 1.5%. So that has shifted to now. With this amendment, they're intending to shift it to 6%. And then again, the implication here, or our rationale for suggesting that this should actually have been maintained to what it was previously, is the same as what I've explained in the previous slide. The unintended consequences of raising a tax rate is while you may perceive that it will generate additional revenue, sometimes possibly not, as consumers are likely to substitute the things that they were consuming from that service. Then the persons to whom the rate applies are likely to pass on that, and in this case, the digital service providers are likely to shift that to the consumers, the additional cost to the consumers, and then we'll see an entire change in market behavior. So it's counterproductive. It's likely to be counterproductive to the objective of raising the rate in the first place. If we had a uniform rate, or if we had maintained a certain rate over a longer period, the certainty it provides is certainly more useful, even for basically for the predictability in market behavior, and is likely to have better consequences in terms of the revenue that will be generated. So that's on clause 8. Then we move to the next, which I think is the one that everyone knows, has been discussing, which is the introduction of the motor vehicle tax. So it's clause 9 of the finance bill, but it intends to introduce a new section to the Finance Act, which will be 12H of the Income Tax Act. So this provision is on introduction of a motor vehicle tax rate at a rate of 2.5% of the value of the car, and it's placed at a minimum of 5,000 shillings and a maximum of 100,000 shillings, regardless of the value of the car. So the costs, the premium that will be paid should be anywhere between 5,000 to 100,000. And the provision is that it's supposed to be collected by insurers at the point of issuing motor vehicle insurance. So again, for this one, we feel that it's the proposal is should be expunged, or the amendment should be deleted, because first of all, there are certain it violates a few things. In our assessment, it constitutes double taxation for the reason that the value of motor vehicles, first of all, already constitutes a substantial portion of taxes. So even in arriving or determining at that value, it already comprises, when owners of motor vehicles purchase the vehicles, it already includes, they pay for import duty, excise duty. There are other duties that relate to, other taxes that are applicable. And so placing an additional tax on taxes is obviously could be construed as being double taxation. And then it's basically by imposing that additional 2.5% of the insured value of the car, this proposal is seemingly penalizing vehicle owners twice on the same asset. Then I think you are all aware that for most motor vehicle owners, or even for you, and basically even for road users, there's a number of fees and levies that are paid for through fuel consumption, through utilization of the road levy. So it's basically over exacerbating that burden or taxation on the same category of people that have actually been bearing the burden. So then the other reason why we thought it's a bad idea is because the behavior that the change in behavior that is likely to result from this motor vehicle tax is to minimize that cost. We are likely to see owners either keeping their cars for longer periods, which would result in an older fleet of vehicles that are possibly unroadworthy, and again, it would be counterproductive to the main objectives relating to policy objectives relating to environmental sustainability, because of course we know older vehicles have higher and worse emissions. Again, for road safety, so it would again go against the policy objectives on road safety. So then lastly, the other reason why it's a bad idea, it's the complexity in terms of the administrative compliance and administrative burden of complying with these requirements has been placed squarely on insurers without clarity on what happens in terms of, for instance, third-party, the persons who ordinarily utilize third-party covers for their vehicles, and the penalties for non-compliance, again, are hefty and have been placed on insurers. And again, as we know, these are likely to be placed back on the owners of the motor vehicles. So those costs are likely to be transferred back. So the incident so even the insurance premium might end up being higher because of that burden of complying, the administrative burden of complying. There are other provisions related to the income tax amendments that are not listed here. For instance, with regards to penalties for non-compliance, the penalties that have been provided by KRA for non-compliance, and the requirement by KRA, the proposal to now have KRA accessing personal data to be able to calculate or arrive at, as part of their avenues for arriving at what should be basically getting personal information on pairs of taxpayers' information. So, for instance, through your M-Pesa details, they are seeking to be able to access M-Pesa information to be able to decide whether or not you are compliant. And this is again in violation of the Data Protection Act. So there's a few other issues that are adding to the complexity of this finance bill, and the additional detail will be provided in the IEA's memorandum that will have a lot more detail than, in addition to what we've said here, it will have more detail on other clauses. So I think I move now to the last part. So that's a summary of the main things that I think have been in the main issues that have been in the public discourse regarding the Income Tax Act. Then in terms of the tax procedures, I will mention briefly the main amendments with regards to tax procedures. Of course, as the name provides, it's mostly procedural amendments, and a few that I'd like to highlight here. A few that I'd like to highlight here we have clause 50, which seeks to amend section 22 of the Tax Procedures Act, which is Cap 469B of the laws of Kenya. And this is just an illustration. So this one seeks to insert the words on the recommendation of the Tax Agents Committee established by regulations prescribed under the Act, immediately after the words commissioner appearing in the opening sentence. So I think this amendment here relates to decisions to cancel a license and is it intended to enhance procedural clarity and accountability by making sure that that decision is not made solely by the commissioner, but that responsibility is spread to a tax agents committee, which of course is governed by certain specific regulations. And so I mean, I don't have any negative thing to say about this. It seemingly is intended to enhance the transparency in the process and ensure that tax agents committee play a formal role in decision-making processes. So that's one of the things that has been changed, and one of the amendments that has been proposed by this bill with regards to tax procedures. We also have the introduction of a new subsection which basically outlines the particulars of the electronic tax invoice that is now supposed to be issued. And here we see that this seems to be an attempt to ensure standardization, seems to be an attempt to ensure standardization in that how the invoice is supposed to look like. And then the other amendments here are also, the other amendments in terms of tax procedures are also mostly procedural. There are no, want to see whether there's anything else I wanted to highlight. So there's a fine. The only other thing that I'll mention is the proposed amendment to section 59A. So a penalty, the clause intends to put a penalty not exceeding 2 million shillings every month for failure to comply with the filing of those returns. And basically here the concern or the implication is that we're seeing that provision by itself is very steep, 2 million for failure to comply every month. Of course, it's unsustainable, most likely unreasonable. And we think that this should be deleted or amended to something that I find that is more likely to be more reasonable and even easier to implement, because by instituting or creating a penalty that you cannot actually implement when violated, again, it's counterproductive to the objective of what that law is intending to do. And it's just creating an additional burden on KRA, and that will not be complied with in any case. I will not talk about the other amendments to do with tax procedures, because I mean, as I mentioned, they're mostly just procedural. I think we can now go to amendments related to value-added tax. Raphael.
Thanks, Jackie. I think Jackie has taken us through the section on income tax, and one of the key issues that she highlighted is that she shared with us the perspective of why the taxation in terms of raising revenue, changing behavior, and of course distribution of income. And she went ahead and shared with us the key clauses that have been changed in each of the act, whether it is the income tax, the VAT Act, Procedure Act, and many others as contained in the finance bill. So I'll be highlighting some of the key issues that are contained in the VAT Act. Let's go to the next. Yeah. Just a quick introduction in terms of definition. I think it is important to understand that when you're talking about VAT, we are talking about an indirect tax that is paid by a person or even a firm who consumes taxable goods. And these taxable goods are supplied in Kenya or they are either imported in Kenya. And it is important to know that there are three types of rates that are applied in VAT. One is the general rate, which is normally alluded as a standard rate. And this one is applicable to goods and taxable services and other zero-rated supplies. That is the general rate. And then we have a zero rate where the applicable the applicable rate for the categories of those supplies is actually at zero rate. And then we have the exempt where the products that you are selling, you tax at zero, but when you come to the claiming of the input tax, then that particular tax you cannot be able to claim. So those three categories are the ones which in each and every year, whenever you hear the issues of VAT, they are very important so that we see which key amendments then is the National Treasury working on. Again, it is important to note that the use of VAT as a measure to raise revenue should be limited, and because the imposition of VAT, particularly to products, actually hurts household, and this effect disproportionately affect the household and affect those people who are actually below the poverty line. And this issue is actually highlighted by the National Treasury did a study, and these are some of the key issues that they highlighted, that use of VAT as a measure to raise the revenue actually affects small households. And as Jackie mentioned, is that in terms of the finance bill, we do think that we do have a very complicated tax system in Kenya. Why? Because if you look in terms of even the VAT Act, if you look at the number of clauses that are being amended, for example, for 2024 finance bill, the number of clauses that are being amended, I think there are 6. But this does not include actually the sub-clauses. And sub-clauses, you look at the first schedule, and then you look at the second schedule. Quite a number. And therefore, what it tells you is that in Kenya, we do have a complex tax system. And then going ahead is that some of them are not coherent. And therefore, it is important that whenever we are checking all this, we understand the context of where we are working on. And therefore, I'll just give some key highlights of some of the crosses that the finance bill addressed, like 5. Let's go to the next one, and I'll start with the first section. If you look at cross 28, subsection 2 or cap 476. And Jackie has just mentioned in terms of standardization, there is a new definition that is being introduced in terms of a tax invoice, that it should include an electronic tax invoice, which should be issued in accordance with section actually 223A of the Tax Procedure Act. And the purpose of doing this is of course to ensure that all the transmission of our invoices are done actually through e-Teams, that is electronic tax invoice management, and therefore it is important. But in terms of implication, what we are saying is that the purpose for this is that the government wants to strengthen the taxation in e-commerce of government, and of course the aspect of making sure that we have an efficient tax collection in this country. Number 2, we have cross 30 of the finance bill. If you look at subsection 12, cap 476, there is also a new subsection that they want to introduce in terms of the definition of the time of supply for the the exported good, and for the registered person, and the whole aspect revolves around the certificate of export, which is key, and the implication of making sure that the definition is clear is to ensure that we have that certainty of when the goods exited actually the country, and of course in terms of even making sure that the taxation is clear, then we do have a definite in terms of certainty, even in terms of canons of taxation. We are certain this is the time that the goods are supposed to exit from the country with a proper documentation. What we would like to add here is that there are quite a number of documentation that are required whenever you are doing something like an export of a product, and therefore there is need to make sure that we have clarification in terms of which documents to accompany the certificate of export. Let's go to the next one. The next cross is actually section 33, cross 33, subsection 34 of CAP 476, and this one requires a deletion. If we remember very well, in the finance bill, or in terms of businesses, small businesses in this country, is that the requirement to register was that you, in terms of turnover on a yearly basis, you're supposed to have a turnover of around 5 billion. The finance bill 2024 proposes that this amount should be increased from 5 million to around now 8 million. And the implication of this is that we expect that there will be a reduction. They reduced in terms of small business enterprises, in terms of reducing the administrative cost, but also it will actually make sure that the number of misreporting of institutions in terms of requirement of registration, there will be few. And then in addition to this is that if the cross actually is deleted, then it means that even in terms of trade, we have more people doing trade, so that given the cross that has been deleted. And then if you look at subsection 8 of the Value Added Act 2013, and you look at the subsection 2, it talks about the amendment, and here it talks about the inclusion of an registered person who supplies services in Kenya. And of course, this is a good move, because generally the government will be able to enhance the level of business operations in the country, but also they will increase the revenue collection by the various registered people in the country. Let's go to the next slide. The other section that we think it is important to highlight is actually section 1. That is section 17 of 476, and the provision allows tax refunds relating to withholding VAT on taxable supplies. And the key issue here is it is on official aid-funded project approved by the cabinet secretary. And the cross goes ahead and mentions that any excess input VAT will not be admissible and can only be carried forward to the subsequent tax period. And we think that this cross, actually, if we look at to the last year's finance bill, actually it was actually exempted. And therefore, the introduction of this, in terms of making sure that it is taxable at a standard rate, we think we should be able to maintain the exemption status of this particular funded project, so that we can so that we don't make this project more expensive. And then if we look at section 35, schedule 2, it's the amendment of section 13A of the value added tax by deleting 13A. And that one, I think the debate has been quite huge in the media, but also at household level on on the supply of bread, and it has been in the Finance Bill 2013. I think it was zero rated, and this year I think it is being exempted. And our argument is that bread is a staple food in this country, and actually it helps the low income households, and therefore putting and making the product exempt, it will mean that the input tax for the manufacturers of bread or suppliers of materials which make bread will not be able to claim the input VAT, and it means that the suppliers will be able to pass this cost to the consumers, making actually the product of bread to be high. And therefore, we don't think it is a good idea. And therefore, this particular cost should be expunged. Let's go to the next one. The next one is Section 34. And basically, if you look at Section 34, it's the amendment to the first schedule of CAP 476. You look at Part 1, Section A. It talks about the changes in the rate from the exemption status to standard rates, and there are quite a number of clauses that has been amended. And I'll start with the ones which are shown on the screen. If you look at A and B, look at airplanes and other aircrafts and their spare parts. They want to introduce standard rates, but remember, in the Finance Bill 2023, they were exempted, and the whole aspect of doing this was that exemption of airplanes and aircraft was actually to ensure that individuals or even firms are able to acquire or acquisition of more modern planes. And our thinking is that the moment we introduce this particular tax, it means that we are going to induce the use of actually the use of older planes, but also this one will compromise the issue of safety concerns. And then the other proposal with respect to the first schedule is the taxation of taxable goods for direct exclusive construction of tourism facilities, recreational parks of 50-acre or more, convention and conference facilities upon recommendation by the Cabinet Secretary responsible for matters related to recreational parks. And remember, last year, the same, I think it was exemption was introduced last year for the sole purpose of making sure that we incentivize and stimulate growth in the tourism sector. Again, reversing this gain after 1 year, we don't think it's a good idea, and therefore what it means is that it will discourage investment in the tourism sector. Again, the discretion of the Cabinet Secretary to retain powers actually to decide on when to exempt or even to zero rate violated the Constitution by making a decision on determining the eligibility of the person who can be able to construct specialized hospitals or facilities and with accommodation facilities in this country. Let's go to the next. The other cross on the first schedule is the taxable services for direct use. Again, for the construction of specialized hospital with accommodation facility. Again, this come after the other cross that I have mentioned, and our thinking is that, and it was there in the last year Finance Bill, is that this proposal, if it is again move from exemption to standard rate, we are saying that we are going to discourage investment in this sector. And one of the things that we have noticed is that, Andre, we hardly have enough time to evaluate the effectiveness of our tax design. And therefore, if, for example, somebody made an investment last year when it was exempt, and infrastructure or even our buildings or houses, 1 year is a very short period. If we keep on changing our tax tax structure in terms of we should be able to rethink about it in terms of it affects business decision at the end of the day. Removal of exemption on plant machinery equipment used in the construction of plastic recycling plants. Again, last year it was exempted. This year they are introducing now standard rates at the rate of 16%. And the aim again for last year for exemption was actually to encourage investment in the sector, and the introduction of VAT standard rate at this particular time, again we are seeing as it will actually discourage investment in that particular sector. And the best tax rate for taxing these particular sectors, actually manufacturing, so it should be actually zero rated, because they again they will be able to claim the input tax, but also it encourages these particular firms to invest more, and this will help. This will not damage our economy. And of course, once we expand this, it will help the government objective of actually ensuring that we are increasing our revenues. Let's move to the next one. Applying, there are quite a number of application of standard rates from zero rate for electric bicycles, and supply of buses, of tariffs. Actually, they are very clear in terms of tariffs. And application of these rates, again we are saying it's against the government green agenda, and what we are saying is that this may lead to reduced growth within the e-mobility sector. Again, the supply of a motorcycle of tariff, again it's very clear. We are saying if this particular cost is if the rates is changed again to standard rates, we are saying it will affect the sector in terms of making sure that the manufacturers will shift this cost to the riders, and therefore it will make the motorcycles unaffordable, and this will actually shift, it will change the demand for the products. Let's go to the next one. Oh yes, now we go to the last section on miscellaneous fees, and those basically were just some highlights of VAT. I know it contains quite a number. There are quite a number of, but those were the main one. If we go to the miscellaneous fees and levies, you look at the act. There are five changes that have been effected, and I will highlight two. One of them is on the import declaration fee. If you look at last year the rate was at it was at 3 point. Finance bill, it was amended to 2.5, and previously it was at 3.5. This year again, the proposal is to delete it from now the current one contained in the finance bill 2.5 to 3%. And what we are saying is this: I mean, we have been having regular revision of the IDF fee rate, and we are saying this is a bad policy. Let's have a consistent in terms of our IDF fee that we are charging, that should be uniform across the East African community. And given that Kenya is a net importer, then if we keep on changing the rates, of course this will affect the cost of our product, and it will make the cost of our product to increase, and this of course will have an effect in terms of the cost of living. And also we are adding, and we are saying that lower tax rate creates less distortions and lower administrative cost for our farms. And if we keep on increasing, we are saying that it will also reduce demand in quantities for imported commodities. Let's go to the next slide, the last one. I promise this will be the last one. The last one is on the introduction. The Miscellaneous Act proposes the introduction of eco levy on the goods specified in the fourth schedule manufactured in Kenya, and this one include batteries, components of electric vehicles. We have solar power, and the argument here is that the proposed levy already exists into the excise duty tax, and therefore a lump sum excise duty tax can be levied on goods considered to have a negative environmental impact. Again, we are saying that heavy taxation is the incentive toward the effort toward e-mobility transition in this country. So I'll leave it at there, and then I invite my colleague Maureen to take us through the exercise duty tax.
Just so you note, the Excess Duty Act is Cap 470 of the laws of Kenya. So we'll be mentioning that a lot during our presentation. And just a definition of what the excess duty is. Most of you know it as the syntax. So yeah, I'll just give a definition both from the KRA and also will refer to a taxation handbook. The IEA has a taxation handbook which was published in 2010. You can check it on the IEA's website. So the excess duty, it's a duty of excess imposed on goods manufactured in Kenya or imported into Kenya and specified in the first schedule of the Excess Duty Act 2021. The Excess Duty Act was done in 2015 and it was revised in 2021. And yeah, it has the first schedule and the second schedule. If you go online and search for it, then also it's a levy that is applied selectively on particular goods and services placed on goods with a negative externality. So what does this mean? The purpose of the Excess Duty Act, which we'll see in some slides that are coming up, it's meant to tax goods with a negative externality. That's how the term syntax comes in. It's meant for maybe fossil fuels that have a negative impact on the environment, or maybe goods that have a negative impact on health, such as alcohol and tobacco. And it's directly paid by manufacturers, but the tax burden is passed to the consumer through an increase on price. This is the tax incidence. It's borne by either the consumers or the producers. And yeah, more often than not, it's passed to the consumers. And it may be applied to either production or sale, to domestic output or inputs. Then we'll move to the foundational principles for excess duty, and this has been mentioned before by the presenters who have explained the different tax heads before. And we have it's used to tax goods with a negative externality. We have explained this as it's meant to cause a behavioral change. For instance, those who are polluting the environment, if they're taxed, perhaps they'll refrain from causing pollution on the environment, or maybe the smokers who are causing maybe health issues on the passive smokers, they'll refrain from the behavior. Then it also has an income effect or a substitution effect. Excess duty has an income effect or a substitution effect. I'll explain why it has an income effect or a substitution effect, and we'll just break down the meaning of these two. An income effect, it causes a change in demand for a good or service caused by an increase or decrease in consumers' purchasing power or real income. And like as you all know, taxes have a distortionary effect on income, either by increasing the income or decreasing the income, depending on how it's been applied. And in other words, it shrinks the funds for use. For instance, if you're using 100 bob to buying bread and fish, if VAT is applied on bread, meaning the price of bread will increase, so you'll have less money to buy fish. Then we have the substitution effect, which explains that a consumer replaces one product with another due to price change. In other words, it makes the substitutes attractive. If maybe you're used to using maybe coffee and a tax is applied on coffee, you might have to shift to using maybe tea or cocoa or something else. And then we have the PFM perspective on excess duty. And under the PFM perspective on excess duty, you have three components. It's used to raise revenue. And by raising revenue, it's applied with this mindset, the absence of close substitutes for addictive or indispensable products such as alcohol, tobacco, and energy implies that the demand is inelastic. So people will have to buy these products either way. And the potential for distortion of economic decisions by the imposition of excess duty is relatively small. So people will still, we still have to buy this, and that's how the government applies excess duty to raise revenue. Then there's the change in behavior by taxing maybe smoking, drinking alcohol, or environmental pollution. You're trying to change behavior by making people refrain from these habits. Then there's the redistribution of income. Redistribution of income from maybe the rich or the people who use these products to the poor by taxing the use of these products. Then we'll move to the amendments of Excess Duty Act, and it had 6 changes without including the subclauses per schedule and the second schedule. And so for this, we'll just do the amendments that were made to the Excess Duty Act 2021. We have Section 5 of CAB 472. They made a new insertion, that's the proposal to impose excess duty on services offered by a non-resident through a digital platform. And we argue that, okay, before we go to the implication, what are these examples of services offered by a non-resident through a digital platform? I'll just give a few examples, which are maybe DSTV, Netflix, gaming, and what implications does imposing an excess duty on these services have on the consumers? It raises the cost of consuming digital services. The people who consume these services will have to pay more or maybe shift to using other alternatives if a tax is applied on these services. And there's also a behavioral response. What do you mean by a behavioral response? It causes a substitution effect whereby people will seek cheaper alternatives, maybe cheaper sites for accessing these services, or maybe they'll be streaming on illegal websites, or they'll be using virtual private network to access the services that they want to access. And also the government has not provided clarity on how these taxes will be collected, and this might raise the administration cost for the Kenya Revenue Authority. Next, we'll be moving to the Section 14 of CAB 472, which was repealed. What do you mean by repealing? Repealing means revoking or annulling a law or act of parliament. And the repealing that was done was a repeal on relief provisions for excess duty paid on purchase of raw materials used in the manufacture of accessible goods, and excess duty paid in respect of internet bulk data services for resale. People who purchase maybe data in bulk and resell it, maybe the internet service providers will have to, the relief that had been provided before in the previous finance bill has been revoked. And what implication does this have? The misapplication of excess tax by raising revenue. The main, sorry, I didn't, in this slide, the main purpose of excess duty should be to change behavior. But in this case, the government will just be raising revenue because they've not outlined which behavior they're trying to change by applying excess duty in the purchase of raw materials used in the manufacture of accessible goods and excess duty. And it also raises the cost of imported raw materials, and this has a secondary effect on consumers because the consumers will have to bear the burden, the incidence of the tax that's applied on imported raw materials. That's from the producer. Then an amendment is being proposed to be made on Section 7 of CAP 472, whereby the Cabinet Secretary will be granted excise duty remission for spirits manufactured from agricultural products manufactured in Kenya. This is an insertion. After the word beer, we have spirits, which will also be, this Cabinet Secretary will be granted duty remission for spirits manufactured from agricultural products. What it read before, the Cabinet Secretary may, on the application by a manufacturer, grant the remission of excise duty at 80% per annum with respect to beer made from sorghum, millet, or cassava, or any other agricultural produce grown in Kenya. This is from the Excise Duty Act 2021. And what implications does this have? It expands the discretion of the CS to grant remission and excise duty on spirits, wines, and beer. And our recommendation was that they should remove the discretion by bureaucrats and maybe apply a rate for maybe a period of 5 years or so. Then an amendment was made to the first schedule of CAP 472, which involves the change of excise duty rate for accessible goods. And I'll be mentioning the various goods through which the excise duty rate was applied, and different rates were applied. The first one, we have the motorcycles. The new excise duty rate, which is being proposed, is 10% of value, or 12,952.83 shillings per unit, whichever is higher. And the implication of this, we think it's a misapplication of the principle of excise taxation, and they should retain the rates that they have currently, because by applying excise duty on motorcycle, we wonder what behavior are they trying to change by imposing this. Then we have imported sugar confectionery. The proposal to raise the price of imported sugar confectionery from 42 shillings and 91 cents per kg to 257.55 shillings per kg. They have not provided evidence that consuming this product is causing a health crisis in Kenya, and therefore they should retain the current rates per kg instead of proposing a new amount per kg. Then we have wines, beer, and spirits, which a new amount has been proposed in a different measurement. We have for wines 243 shillings 0.43 per liter to a new measurement 22 shillings and 50 cents per centiliter of pure alcohol. Then we have beer from 142 shillings and 44 cents per liter to 22 shillings and 50 cents per centiliter of pure alcohol. And lastly, we have spirits at 356 shillings 0.42 per liter to 16 shillings per liter per centiliter of pure alcohol. In real sense, this is an increase of prices for these products. If you break down the calculations, as much as they've shifted it from liters to centiliters, it's an increase in prices. However, we comment that this is a good principle on taxation against the volume of pure alcohol, and the increase in prices will shift demands towards will shift the incentive towards demand of illicit brews. The government for a long time has been trying to campaign and fight against illicit brews, and I don't know whether the increase in prices is the good principle to apply here, because it's evident. Also, it's evident that beverages, the alcoholic beverages with a high alcoholic content, will incur a relatively lower tax rate for the alcohol itself if the measurement is to a centiliter of pure alcohol. And so maybe they should retain the current prices, but shift the taxation against volume of pure alcohol. Then we have cigarettes. We have cigarettes with filters and cigarettes without filters. For cigarettes with filters, the current rate is 4,067 per mil to 4,100 shillings per mil. And for cigarettes without filters, the current rate is 2,926 per mil. And the proposal is to increase it to 4,100 shillings per mil. And the implication for this, the high taxes will result in cross-border sale of illicitly acquired cigarettes. That's regional smuggling. According to research, 1 in 5 cigarettes sold in Kenya are illegal. Why? Yeah, because a cigarette is an inexpensive, physically small and highly valuable product, making it attractive for smuggling. It's easy to smuggle cigarettes across borders, and also something going on with the currency, Kenyan currency. Currently, the Kenyan currency has, recently since February, the Kenyan currency has appreciated, and Kenyans can afford more imported goods. So it strengthens the impetus for imports. So people can be able to import cigarettes from our neighbors. Given their currency, we can import cigarettes from different countries and sell them back in Kenya. Given the attractiveness of the currency, and also people will shift to maybe cheaper cigarettes if it's imported and it's cheaper in the country compared to the increase that's being proposed in the new finance bill. Then we have products containing nicotine or nicotine substitutes. The current rate is 1,594.50 per kg to 2,000 shillings per kg, and liquid nicotine from 70 shillings per milliliter to 100 shillings per milliliter. For liquid nicotine, it was increased in 2022 to 70 shillings per milliliter and it's been increased again they're proposing to increase it to 100 shillings per milliliter. And the implication for this is the substitutes for nicotine are preferable due to the lowered risk of health. Tobacco contains tar and nicotine, and tar is the cancer-causing substance. And liquid nicotine and these substitutes for tobacco, if the prices are increased, people will still continue consuming tobacco, which is more harmful. So it's like a disincentive towards less harmful products. Then they should maintain the existing rates to ensure substitution towards smokeless products. By consuming liquid nicotine is like the vape products, and they're less harmful compared to tobacco cigarettes. Yeah. Then we have an increase in tax rates for vegetable oils. Initially, in the current finance bill, it's zero rated, and the proposal is to impose a 25% excise duty rate on vegetable oils. Vegetable oils is used across all households, and it doesn't have a substitute. So by applying excess duty rate and a 25% excess duty rate will lead to higher product prices for households because of the absence of alternatives, and it will cause an income effect. People will have to, the funds that they are using will shrink because and given that it's a commodity that's necessary for use in our day-to-day cooking in the house, people will have to to forgo buying some other products so that they can buy vegetable oil, and also applying excess duty for food products is a bad principle of taxation, given that data shows that 1 in 5 children in Kenya are stunted. So by applying the excess duty on food products, it's not a good principle of taxation. Yeah, because you might lead to more stunted growth in children. Then an amendment was made on the first schedule to CAP 472 Part 2, which proposes a change in rates for accessible services that's from 15% to 20%. And this is for telephone and internet data services, transfer fees by banks, money transfer agencies and financial service providers, fees for money transfer services by cellular phone service providers, betting, game, prize competition, fees charged on adverts via the internet and social media, lottery, that's excluding charitable lottery. The ones that are in a different color, that's orange, like the necessities that we think by applying an excess duty on this, it's not a good principle of taxation. And yeah, for betting, gaming and prize competition and lottery, those are goods with a negative externality. So for the phone and internet data services, in the financial year 2021, the finance bill, they proposed a decrease, in the previous finance bill, they proposed a decrease from 20% to 15%, and they're now proposing to increase it to 20%. So looking at the implications, we are wondering, the application of excise tax on financial services, it affects affordability because, yeah, these are necessities that people use on a day-to-day basis, and applying excise tax on this, it reduces the affordability, and it also represents the violation of the principles of taxation, like I've explained before. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
I'll try and sum up in 2 minutes. I know we spent much more time than we promised. So my colleague Jacqueline took us through the tax procedures and the Income Tax Act, highlighting that there are specific changes within them affecting incomes. I think the contentious point you mentioned was a question about the motor vehicle tax. There's a question related to that as well, but we'll discuss that and that as well. I mean that too. So we've gone through several iterations. Several changes in the Income Tax Act. I think the Income Tax Act has the highest number of single changes related to one clause, and not the sub-clauses related to it. As we said, there are 64, a total of 64 different clauses in different acts that have been changed that affects taxation and, of course, the procedures. And then Raphael went down to VAT and miscellaneous fees and levies. Again, similar to what Jacqueline has showed to us, basically it's showing an increasing complexity in the shifting of VAT from any of the 3 bands. But you see substantially most of the shifts coming from either exempt to standard rate or 0 rated to exempt, showing that tax rates are actually rising for goods and services, or rather for the goods and services for which VAT is being applied, the miscellaneous fees as well, an expansion of miscellaneous fees to cover many other things, financial services, and across as well. And then in part 3, Maureen took us through the Excise Duty Act and a couple of the first and second schedule. Here again, we have the question about excise duty applied. And I hope you all noticed that the Excise Duty Act spoke about only manufactured goods. Since then, it's been amended, not necessarily amended in terms of its purpose, but it's been applied to an increasing number of services as well. She questioned the question of the application of the principle of excise taxation, just like we questioned the principle of the application of income tax to many other sectors, creating new distortions, and obviously the possibility of tactical behavior about where people situate their businesses, what effects it has. Now, as I conclude and go back to asking the questions that have been raised, I'd like us to just say two things. I think as the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I stress the word economics here, while we understand the imperative for government to collect revenues, which is the dominant source of funding public services, whatever the quality of those public services may be, as economists, we're sufficiently conscious that a tax does not just transfer income from government, from individuals, from farms or households to the government. It has certain effects on the market itself, including not just what we call distortions, but actually shrinks markets, reduces people's incomes. So that's why we talk about the substitution effect and the income effect. Our colleagues also alerted us to the fact that there are three major purposes for public taxation and public economics. One is for government to raise revenue. Second is to shift, first to raise revenue. Second is to create, to resolve differences in income, to redistribute income. And the third, obviously, is to shift behavior. We've seen substantially that most of the new tax changes that we've seen here are related to either raising revenues as the dominant reason to raise revenues. And even when excise taxes are applied for the purposes of shifting behavior, we don't think they're shifting behavior in the right way. Most of what it will do is just simply to collect government revenue, to pick revenue. And so we can see that the dominant idea regarding Finance Bill 2024, and we are conscious that it hasn't been passed, but we know it'll happen in a couple of weeks, is basically to raise revenues. Whatever the fiscal position of government is, the dominant question here is just government trying to raise revenues. And so that's it. We also say that, look, the whole bill is 136 pages. Of course, it's altering 64 clauses, but there are some clauses, and some clauses are actually a whole page or a whole chapter of a different law or a different schedule that has been. So the amount of changes that have been made are so many that the question about the complexity of Kenya's tax laws is one that concerns us. Finally, I'd like us to, I think my colleague Jacqueline mentioned it, but let me reiterate. The finance bill itself, as you can tell, is a collection. It's one bill related to the budgets, but it's a collection of amendments to other existing laws. So basically, it is not a bill in itself in that way, but it's a bill that consolidates what new tax changes will be, but it's amending other laws and other schedules of government. Other schedules of existing statutes. So I'd like to open this to a question and answer. And I will first read what questions there are here, and then open up immediately after to that. So Lillian, Lillian asked, of the changes Jacqueline mentioned, how many amendments to clauses that were changed in Finance Bill 2022-23? I think any of my colleagues could answer that. Then the second one is, does the Finance Bill Act have to change every year? What are the implications if we decided to continue with the current Act? You're saying that the chair of the Departmental Committee on Finance and National Planning recently argued that the government would shut down if we didn't have bills tabled every year. How true is this? Okay, I'll let my colleagues answer, but I'll laugh and wink at that. Then there's somebody called Kalari who says, what are the implications for the motor vehicle tax to the automotive industry? So that would be Jackie's question. I think she'd answered it already, but we can state it again. And then Lillian comes, on the motor vehicle tax, there's an argument in the public discourse of it being a wealth tax and not an income one. If it does pass, can it then be challenged in court? That's for Jackie as well. Victor asks, how about the proposed amendment to the Data Protection Act to allow unrestricted access? I think that's too Jackie's talked about. Wycliffe says, what's the implication of parliamentary committee chair coming out to state that views obtained from the public as regards the motor vehicle tax will not be taken into consideration? I'm not too sure that's what he said, but my colleagues could state that. Can the decision thereon be challenged in court? Lillian says, the Finance Bill 2024 is very heavy on indirect taxes compared to last year. Is there a particular reason government could be doing this? Is it easy to collect indirect taxes? Any of our colleagues could answer that. The motor vehicle tax is something that should be discussed further because it will favor the people with expensive motor vehicles. It would be fair if the tax threshold is removed. Okay. It seems that excise duty is increasingly being applied on goods and services which don't have negative externalities. Take telecommunication services. Where's the negative externality if I call my grandma? Good question. Maureen will give you an answer. And then somebody asked us to move the slides. Lillian is back. She says the bill proposes excise duty on services offered through a digital platform, and there's also a withholding tax of digital marketplace mentioned earlier. Are these referring to the same thing? You talk about the externality questions again. Paloma asks whether we'll share the presentation. And then we have Esther gives scenarios where the proposals by IEA to a committee of parliament help to change the ban policy. That wasn't our intention today, but any of our colleagues who wishes to can answer that. And Amolo asks, are you able to tell how much of proposal changes are to allow Kenya to pay back IMF loans taken since this government administration came to power? Okay, so any of our colleagues, I'll allow each of my colleagues 3 minutes to respond to whichever questions you pick so that we can go to a second set of questions. In the meantime, as they answer those, if you have other questions that you'd like to ask, please raise your hand. There's a toolbar right floating up there that allows you to raise your hand and you'll ask. So this time I'll reverse the order of presentations. I'll start with Mo. Please pick any two. Don't take more than 3 minutes because we're already well over our time so that we can have a second and a third series of questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'd like to answer the question on, sorry about that. Yeah, I'd like to answer the question on excess duty being applied on phone call. I don't think calling your grandma has a negative externality, and yeah, it's like we've mentioned before, it's a bad principle of taxation because the main purpose of excess duty is to change behavior. So by applying this, it just reduces the affordability and raises government revenue if that's their purpose, but it does not reduce any negative externality. And also the question on, yeah, excise was mainly applied to, this is Lillian's question, I believe. Excise was mainly applied to goods with negative externality, and collection was also supposed to rehabilitate those affected by, say, alcohol. Does this actually happen, or it's all just revenue now? I tend to think there are government institutions that act as rehabs, and I think it's applied in terms of subsidizing treatment of say these alcoholics and these programs that are being run. Yeah, if I agree, it's supposed to be used for that purpose. And also the question on whether withholding tax on digital services and tax applied on services offered through digital platforms, I don't think it's the same thing. And also the question on whether the Finance Act has to change every year. I don't think it's necessary that it should change every year. And I think, yeah, Rafael will answer more on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mo, for answering a few. I think I have like 3 questions I will address. The first question was asked by Rivian about the finance bill. 2024 is very hard on indirect taxes. And one of the things I want to mention is that indirect taxes are taxes that are paid the moment you consume a product. And therefore, it is true. It is one of the easiest taxes that the government is able to levy. And therefore, I think that's something, when you're talking about direct taxes, these are taxes that are paid directed to the government, something like PYE, corporation tax, and etc. And in terms of noting some of the effects of the indirect taxes, one of the things that we realized in the course of the year is that the tax on fuel, it is an indirect tax, and because the government increased the rates from 0, I think, for fuel from 0 to 16. I think in terms of having more people consuming the product, it ended up by ensuring that the government did not actually meet its revenue target. Number two, in terms of does the finance bill have to be reviewed actually every year? In Kenya, the finance bill or the amendments, the finance bill actually done on an yearly basis. And the reason why they normally do that is that there are some proposed revenue, more additional revenue that is supposed to be corrected. For example, this year, I think that the additional revenue that was supposed to be corrected was around, based on the amendments of the finance bill, was around 377B compared to last year, which was 211. But what we have realized, and if you check the quarterly budget implementation report from the central bank or even the national treasury, is that the revenue target by the third quarter are not met. So our proposal was that during the sharing of a memorandum to the national treasury, is that there should be a sunset cross when we are revising, when we are supposed to have amendments to the finance bill. Actually, after every 3 years, we can have amendments to some of the tax codes. The other question is on can VAT refunds be claimed on exportation of zero-rated? I think the answer is yes. And what I said is this: there is a difference between exemption and zero rating, because once you have products which are zero rated, then you are allowed for whenever you are doing you are claiming for refund, you are supposed to file an input tax. You are supposed to claim that. But for exemption, I think that exemption does not allow for claiming of the input VAT. So thanks. I think I pass over to Jackie. Jackie, most of the issues, I think they are on income tax.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so I'll attempt to respond to a few. So the first question by Lillian on how many amendments of what I mentioned, how many are amendments to clauses that were changed in the Finance Bill 2023. I'll say at least 3 of the 5 main ones were things that were amended last year, beginning with the first one on income from businesses where foreign exchange loss or gain is realized. The other one on income from employment, the one that they tried to amend it last year, but at some point, I think following public participation, it was not included. But now they've tried to include it again, where they're attempting to make the exemptions to expenditure incurred from performance of official duties by public officers. And then there was also the other one on digital services tax, which they're now moving to the significant economic presence tax. So the previous one was the main digital services tax one had been enacted last year. So, and remember what I provided was only a summary of some of the proposals. I think what we can do is go back and check for each of the sections that we've discussed, how many of these are proposals that were initially made last year and how many have been changed. I mean, the extent of the change this year for all the sections. So even from the summarized presentation, I'll say it's 3 out of 5, but we can give you a more comprehensive answer after we look at all of them together. And yeah, then the other question here was does the Finance Act, Raphael has responded to that, whether the Finance Act has to change every year and what implications are. The only thing I'd add to what Raphael has said is, yes, he's explained that the changes are primarily to the changes in the tax rates and heads is primarily to try and generate additional revenue to meet the targets. But the balance that I think should be sought is there should be some sort of certainty, some long-term certainty, even if we need to adjust some rates to be able to match revenue targets. There should be long-term certainty, because otherwise, if we keep changing it without respecting the main tenets of good taxation policy, then those proposals end up being counterproductive because, as we mentioned in our discussion, usually the market readjusts, the market behavior changes with the unpredictable tax changes. So that's what I'd say. So then the other question was on the, now regarding the motor vehicle tax, there was a question by Omondi who was asking, what would be the implications to the automotive industry? And he's particularly asking for, with regards to car manufacturers, car sales and distribution. I think, as I'd mentioned earlier, given that the first thing that it will do is to increase the ownership costs of motor vehicles, it's given that this proposal is will obviously increase the overall cost of owning a vehicle, we see that it might likely deter people from even purchasing new cars, especially persons in the lower and middle income brackets. And then this increased cost of owning the vehicle will likely lead to a decreased demand for new cars. So we can interpret that to see what that would mean, the decreased demand, what it would mean for car manufacturers. So whether they need to adjust the production volumes, but it's likely that with this, if this goes through, if this proposal goes through, that there's likely to be that reduced demand, or people might adjust to either buying like smaller, either more affordable, less efficient vehicles. So that is another implication. But persons that might actually benefit from this would be the industry involved in car repairs, maintenance costs, repairs, as a consequence of people keeping older cars for longer to avoid the higher costs. There might be like a small industry that might benefit because we are likely to have more vehicle repairs. So those might be the only people that benefit. So there's a likely ripple effect in terms of the persons who gain employment from sale of motor vehicles, because we know that there's an entire industry related to that. So there's, I mean, there are far-reaching effects if we think about that proposal broadly. Then the other question by Lillian, still on the motor vehicle tax, regarding the classification as a wealth tax. So she says that there's an argument in the public discourse of this being a wealth tax and not an income one. And if this passes, can it be challenged in court? So I think I'd be inclined to agree with the persons arguing that the motor vehicle tax is not necessarily an income. It's more of a wealth tax, because income tax is basically levied. If we think about it strictly, income tax is should be levied on the earnings or the income that an individual or a firm makes. Now, this motor vehicle tax is basically a tax on ownership of that vehicle. So it's a tax on an asset that someone owns. So in my view, I think I'd agree that this is more, I mean, it's more of a wealth tax rather than an income tax. And onto the second part of your question, whether this can be challenged in court, I think when we began the presentation, we explained that it seems to us that the object of our taxation policy is not, Parliament has not been very sharp in terms of clarifying the main object. It seems that every proposal is just primarily to raise revenue or without thinking of other consequences. So I think this can be challenged in court in terms of if, for example, a person can demonstrate to the court that the proposal is in violation of key constitutional principles, for instance, under Article 201 of the Constitution on the principles of PFM, the requirement for fairness and equity and equality in terms of fairness in tax administration, equity in terms of distribution of tax burden, So if it can be proven on this ground that the tax will place an inordinately high burden on motor vehicle owners, and there are no separate corresponding benefits for like the broader population, then I think it can be challenged successfully. So that would be my response to that. And then there was another question here by Victor on how about the proposed amendment to the Data Protection Act to allow unrestricted access to financial data. I think this one is very sensitive. In my view, I think it would be unconstitutional, allowing that blatant unrestricted access. So I think it would raise a number of legal and constitutional concerns. So, for instance, we know that in the Constitution, we have the right to privacy guaranteed under Article 31, which basically includes or states that the right includes the right not to have personal information relating to private affairs unnecessarily required or revealed. And I feel that this unrestricted access to financial data, which is very sensitive information, would violate the right. And even though there are exceptions, of course, there are a few instances where there are exceptions, but this would only be it should be demonstrated that this is as a measure of last resort. I think that financial data by its very nature is very inherently personal, it's sensitive. And so this allowing that unrestricted access could lead to abuse and likely misuse of that information, because you never know subsequently where that information might end up. It could lead to fraud. We know about the issues of cyber fraud, so it could exacerbate such issues, which in turn would be a threat to the right to security. So I think there is quite a number of grounds on which it can be challenged for, that provision is likely to be challenged in court. Then I think the last one, okay, so there's the Wycliffe asked about the chair of the parliamentary committee, you say stated that the views from the motor vehicle tax will not be taken into consideration. I will also agree. I did not exactly hear this part, him say this. So I cannot confirm that he said this. However, if it can be proven that those statements were made and those are statements in the public domain, and there is that proof, if it can be proven that this was not necessarily an exercise in respect or to advance public participation as expressed in the Constitution, then of course I think the court would have to consider based on like the totality of evidence whether or not he made the statement, and if it was a mere formality, or if the exercise fulfilled the key requirements of useful, meaningful public participation. So I think we'd have to find that evidence, and then if it's presented and the court accepts it, then yeah, we know how the decision would follow. I think those are the last one. That's the last response I'd like to make.
Let me say two things that I think came off from the conversation. The one that I'd just like to touch upon is that basically, does finance bill need to be changed annually? I had to make sure, because I've always had the view that there's no reason to change the finance bill annually. And I looked through the chapter 12 of the Constitution, and it doesn't exist. There's no requirement for a finance bill to be changed annually. It requires the appropriations bill to be made, but not necessarily a finance bill annually. So that's one. The annualization of the finance bill is a carryover from before the last Constitution, and then therefore it has been embedded through the Public Finance Management Act, perhaps based on the fact that Treasury itself considers it its own financing initiative, and therefore tries to take that. And then finally, as a question of principle, in presidential systems, which is what we have, regardless of whether we think it is perfect or not, it is very, very odd to have tax bills presented annually. because a tax law tends to be the responsibility of the legislature, and they tend to set it over time and set it with given, beg your pardon, they set it with given sunset dates, allowing for its review over time. So when you have a sunset date, it means that the tax bills are meant to apply over time. It's also sensible economic management because it allows investment, it allows savings, it allows decisions to be made to make sure that the tax environment, tax policy environment is stable, unless obviously there's a shock that requires any adjustments to be done. So that's basically, I think, the thing. But it's a culture that are carried forward from the fact that we had a parliamentary system, or what was considered more or less like a parliamentary system, and the finance minister, in presenting the budget bills, would also be presenting, the appropriations would also be presenting financing proposals, which in my view are not even necessary now, on account of the fact that the constitution does not explicitly demand for them, but the PFM seems to have accommodated. I think it's also, as my colleague mentioned, because the Treasury feels they need to tweak taxes every year as they chase revenues, and that's become tradition. But in my view, I think it's something that would support Parliament stopping and actually establishing a stable tax environment, which allows for taxes to grow as the economy performs, and therefore those new revenues are the ones that the executive should account for, especially since we have a medium-term expenditure framework, which assumes a 3-year rolling plan for both expenditures and taxation. So that means that you set taxes, which means that whatever proposals you have are accommodated within the medium-term expenditure framework. Anyway, let me leave that aside. I don't know whether the other questions, I'm conscious that we need to close, but I don't know whether the other questions. One more question, of course, Dominic has asked for the slides to be shared. We'll make sure that they'll be shared. I'll ask my colleague, Esther is asking whether the submissions during the Finance Bill 2023 were taken into account. So any of my colleagues could mention, yes, some proposals that we did were taken into account. And then Emmanuel asked, Emmanuel Yebe, I hope I read that right. Is this quest to increase the tax to GDP ratio sustainable to the Kenyan populace? And is it a good justification to keep increasing the taxes on a yearly basis? I think my colleagues would answer that. Jackie, Raphael, or Maureen, each of you could give it some attention. Emmanuel has asked Wachendo, who's our colleague at the IEA, and do you detect any benefits to state functionaries, state-connected actors that inflate this finance bill? Are they baking in benefits to themselves? I think I saw one proposal to bake in benefits to state functions, especially for the judiciary, who already received cars, and that requirement that when an asset is required or is acquired, then a member a state officer or anybody performing functions within the public sector is not required to pay taxes there. And you know how the courts recently concluded a very self-interested argument about whether judges should receive car grants and whether they would be responsible for taxes or not, regardless of the fact that the same court says that whoever gave those privileges did not have the legal right to give them. Very, very odd arguments in Kenya today about Kenya's taxes. And then the final one by Eric Musau is, how does the annual tax changes reconcile with other agreements such as the EAC, AFTA, and double taxation treaties that Kenya has signed? So let me start this time with Raphael. Raphael, we go to Raphael, we come to Jackie. Or let me go in the same way that we started. We'll start with Mo, and then we'll go to Raphael, and Jackie will conclude together with making your final comments, unless other questions come in that interim period. So let me start with Mo.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to answer Emmanuel's question. He asked, is this case to increase the tax to GDP ratio sustainable to the Kenyan populace? Is it a good justification to keep increasing the taxes on a yearly basis? Okay, currently as it is, Kenyan taxes are above the optimum, and it's above the primary target. And the IMF has been pressing for higher taxes to enhance Kenya's growth, but maybe it's for a different purpose. I don't think it's good, for instance, to increase taxes on food. For instance, adding VAT on bread and other food items, for instance, vegetable oils. Given the state of the nation, maybe 1 in 5 children are stunted. yeah, I don't think it's a good idea to keep increasing taxes on a yearly basis. And yeah, the tax to GDP ratio is not sustainable. And also, yeah, the question on whether they're able to meet the revenue targets that they have on a yearly basis. We've seen an increase of supplementary budgets being created because they're not able to, yeah, meet the projections on revenue that they've made on a yearly basis. And yeah, thank you everyone for attending the webinar. And please read again the finance bill to understand more about it. Thank you everyone.
I think I can handle two questions. One is on the proposals that we normally share with the finance committee taken by the committee. One of the things I want to mention is that each and every year, whenever the finance committee invite members of public to share their memorandum, they normally do a report. Previously, for the last 3 years, I think they used never to share their reports. But last year, I think the report from the Finance and Planning Committee was shared widely. And what I realized is that some of the proposals that were shared from all the institutions, actually they were in a huge report, and they indicated some of the proposals that they rejected and some of the proposals that they picked from some of the memorandums that we shared. But the majority of the proposals that we shared as institution, most of them were not actually picked up. They unilaterally made their own decisions. Number two, for Emmanuel, in terms of increasing tax to GDP, one of the things I want to mention, if you want to measure the health of an economy, you look at the economic activities together with the various sectors that we have in our economy in terms of performance. And therefore, what it means is that if we increase taxation of these particular farms, what it means is that we will not be able to have more farms that will be able to have activity. And therefore, in terms of revenue collection, I think it will go down. And we have seen this where we do not create a good environment for our manufacturing sector so that we can have more economic activities, and therefore you are able to collect even more indirect taxes, which enhances revenue collection in this country. So we need to rethink as a country in terms of spreading our tax base so that we can be able to enhance revenue collection. Finally, in terms of my concluding remarks, I think we have seen tremendous improvement in terms of participation in the finance bill from last year. But we need to do more by making sure that we engage even with the members of parliament, particularly the finance committee, and telling them that it doesn't matter whatever we share with you guys, because we need to see our input taken into consideration so that we can see effect. Otherwise, thank you very much, everybody, for attending our meeting. Thanks.
In conclusion, I'll respond to the question I'll just add to the question, is the quest to increase the tax to GDP ratio sustainable to the Kenyan populace, and is it a good justification to increase the taxes on a yearly basis? So in addition to what Mo has said and Raphael, I say, of course not. So I think, in my view, increasing the tax to GDP ratio by consistently raising taxes is not sustainable for a few reasons. So, of course, I think we've already know that increased tax rates tend to reduce the amount of disposable income available to persons. And of course, what this translates to is a reduced standard of living, reduced ability to save, invest, reduced ability for proper consumption. So I mean, I think we can see the negative implications here. And then it's likely the increased tax rates tend to lead to inflationary pressures. So this is likely to again, negatively impact the population because of the higher standard of higher cost of living. And I think eventually, if we keep raising these taxes, as we have mentioned here, the objective of raising the revenue, for instance, the implication tends to be the implication on the market tends to be counterproductive to the main objective. So I think in the end, we'll end up having tax fatigue. We've already had Kenyans complaining regarding the being overburdened by tax, by the current tax rates. And we are likely to see in future, if this continues, like lower compliance rates, increased tax evasion, which of course would be counterproductive to what they're trying to achieve in the first place. So I would say that it's not sustainable, as Raphael has said, and more we need to think about other alternatives, rethinking the efficiency in tax administration and tax collection, and even as we rethink about expanding the tax base, the government needs to be very cognizant of the interaction of all the factors and what would be like the most sustainable approach in levying proper taxes that would achieve the ultimate goals of taxation that we spoke about. So in closing, I'd say, like all my other colleagues, thank you to all of you for attending this. Someone asked whether we'll share the slides. Yes, we will. And I think Kwame will also see when he's summarizing that in addition to this, we'll also share IEA's brief will also be available on the website. So thanks everyone, and back to you, Kwame.
And Eric Misawa asked, how does the annual tax changes reconcile with other agreements such as EAC? I think with the EAC, some of the tax changes that we have here are based on what is agreed in EAC. EAC has a lot of progressive taxation things, but some of it is very protectionist. Things such as export taxes on grain approved, import taxes approved, provided they're not from within the region, obviously because of a common external tariff. So yes, it's a mixed bag. Some of them actually violate what is agreed within the EAC, and the African Continental Free Trade Area doesn't necessarily have a tough tax, a fixed tax regime anyway, but that does happen. But I think one of the things that we conclude is that, one, Kenya's taxation system is getting too complex and incoherent. Complex by the number of things that it has to change. Remember that each of those tax codes, so whether it's a taxation, income tax, is itself a very big law. Some of them go to hundreds of pages. Then you have the excise tax itself, about 90 or so pages. Then we have a VAT itself, very, very complicated with many schedules, miscellaneous fees, and then we have excise duty and all of those. And each of those changes in terms of not just the tax rates, new definitions, the cleanups on the previous years. So obviously, the tax terrain in Kenya is extremely complicated. Basic economic analysis tells you, and this is by people who won the Nobel Prize in economics, that tax rates should be simple, low, and spread across as much as possible. So we support anything that spreads taxes, but anything that raises tax rates, almost for fun, like happened, is a bit worrying. It answers the question about whether this year's resort to more consumption taxes and indirect taxes is necessary. I think the direct taxes last year were exhausted. If you remember, the VAT on fuel came from 8.5% and was taken all the way to 16%. From 8 all the way to 16%, which means it doubled. And the effect of that was a 23% reduction in the volume of the volume of fuel that was consumed. So obviously that went opposite, even if some revenue was gained by government. And then this year, because you've almost exhausted all income taxes and all direct forms of taxes, so it's going down to indirect forms of taxes. And that's where we are. It's an extremely complex one. There are a few things that, of course, government did well through this finance bill, which was basically to expand the remission the remission for pensions, which allows, of course, extended the amount that is free of tax from about 20,000 shillings to 30,000 shillings a month. That's all good, even though it's taken place after a long time. So it's not necessarily adjusted for inflation. But all these, our function today was just basically to walk us through what we think are some of the main things that the tax code will change in Kenya's economy at the household level, at the farm level, and obviously macroeconomic. At the household level for farms and also for individuals, because it has those effects. Many of them entail raising tax rates, whether it's excess tax, income tax, and all that. Some of them are odd, even conceptually, about whether we should have a wealth tax for vehicles or whether it should be an income tax and that. But Parliament is doing its job. What we'd like to advise you as well is, after this, don't just take our word. Please find yourself a copy of the finance bill for this year, for 2024, and look at it. I'm sure in one way or the other, you're directly or indirectly affected. And if you have any questions, please send it to us, and we'll try as much as possible to give you answers.